What's up guys, my name is Ace, and welcome back to the Versus series. This is the series where I take two similar elements from a Call of Duty game, put them side by side, have a deep look at their stats to find out which one is best. In today's episode, by popular request, we're going to be having a look at the Claymore versus the Proximity Mine. And I guess let's just hop right into it. Let's first up have a look at the trigger ranges and the damage ranges of each of these, and then we'll put them side by side. First up, let's have a look at the Claymore. For the Claymore, this is your trigger area. So it extends out to 4.5 meters, which is a pretty good distance. And then the angle at which that pie is formed is a 20-degree angle on each end. And it actually follows the lasers quite nicely this time. In previous Call of Duty games, a lot of times it felt like those lasers were just purely visual and they didn't actually line up with the trigger area. This time around, they actually line up very nicely with the trigger area, which means you can often sneak by a Claymore if you can just make sure that you manage to stay outside of those lasers. Next up, we have our total damage area, and the Claymore will deal damage out to 5 meters, so not much longer than the trigger area. However, the angle at which the damage will come out of the Claymore is more like 30 degrees rather than 20. So this means even if you're outside the lasers, if that Claymore goes off due to somebody shooting it, or maybe a teammate runs and sets the Claymore off, you still can take damage from it. As for our lethal damage range, this is assuming core game modes at full health without using the EOD perk. The lethal range on this is just 3.5 meters, and once again it extends out to about 30 degrees. So this means if you're on the outer edge of the trigger area of a Claymore, if you're approaching it head on, it's generally not going to kill you unless you're moving quite quickly towards it. However, in most situations it'll be placed around a corner for instance, and therefore it can be quite difficult to avoid that lethal area. But we will be looking at evasion techniques and what works and what doesn't a little bit later on in the video. Now this brings us to the exact damage numbers, and right up close to a Claymore, if you're standing literally right in front of it when it goes off, you will be receiving 140 damage if you're not using EOD. So obviously you're going to die from that because you just have 100 health. Then right out to the outer edge of where the Claymore can deal damage to you, it will deal a minimum of 80 damage. So quite a bit actually. If you're taking damage from a Claymore, it's really going to hurt you unless you have EOD. So that's a Claymore. Now let's move into the Proximity Mine, and then we'll overlay them so you guys can see the comparison. But with the Proximity Mine, there is a trigger radius of 2.5 meters, and that's 360 degrees, doesn't matter what angle you approach that at. And I was actually quite surprised to see at just how small of a trigger radius this is. You can walk pretty close to one of these Proximity Mines without setting it off. This is kind of funny when you contrast that with the damage area. As you can see here, there is a pretty massive damage area. The radius on this is 7 meters, and once again, 360 degrees. That is huge. That will often cover an entire room, so anybody that enters that is going to be taking damage. As for our lethal damage area, this is also quite a big area. We've got a radius of 5 meters here. So when it comes to overall room coverage, the Proximity Mine is clearly going to be better than the Claymore, and you've got a much better chance of getting multiple kills with a single use. As for the damage, the Proximity Mine actually deals more damage at its center as well. We can deal up to 200 damage right on the very center of the Proximity Mine, and then that will decay all the way down to 80 damage at the outer edge of where it can deal damage. So at the outer edge, it deals the same amount of damage as the Claymore, but right in the middle, it's dealing quite a bit more damage than the Claymore does. Now, if we were to overlay the Claymore on top of the Proximity Mine here, you can definitely see that the Proximity Mine has way more total damage coverage potential and way more lethal potential than the Claymore. But it's not time to click off the video yet, because there are several other factors that come into play here that are very important that will give the Claymore an edge over the Proximity Mine in various situations. And the first big factor outside of these damage ranges that we want to look at is the trigger delay. How long does it take from when each of these are triggered to when they actually explode? How much time do you have to react to these? With the Claymore, the trigger delay is about 300 milliseconds, and keep in mind the average human reaction time is roughly 200 milliseconds, so this means you generally have just enough time to process the fact that you're about to die to the Claymore, and you don't generally have any extra time to do anything about it. As for the Proximity Mine, the trigger delay is about 880 milliseconds, so significantly slower than the Claymore, more than twice as slow. And in this case, there's actually a good amount of time for you to process what's going on and react to that situation. So right here, the Claymore really starts fighting back, and you can start to see the balance swing a bit more in the Claymore's favor. However, the next thing I want to look at are the different evasion techniques, assuming you don't have the EOD perk equipped, which we will look at EOD in a little bit, but what sorts of evasion techniques will work against the Claymore versus the proximity mine? The first thing I tested is simply sprinting past it, using the tactical sprint option with double time and an SMG in my hand. Can you just straight up sprint past these? Well, with the Claymore, I set this up in a situation you would tend to find Claymores in, like right around a corner, for instance, on a doorway. Would you be able to just run past this? The answer to this is usually not. Normally, you won't be able to survive this. There are some situations where this will work out for you, especially if you can get really close to the base of the Claymore. At that point, you might be able to get past it by sprinting. But in most situations, if the Claymore is placed properly, it's just not going to work for you. You're going to die to that. As for the proximity mine, this just doesn't work. Trying to sprint past it, you can't get out of there in time. Even with that trigger delay and everything, you just can't get outside of that massive lethal radius in time just by sprinting alone. Now, the next thing I tested is jumping, and once again, with the Claymore, I do find that sometimes jumping might be able to help you. I don't know if this is just placebo, but there have been many situations in game where I have kind of jumped over a Claymore and set it off and completely avoided damage from it. That could have just been that I was combining that with sprinting, so maybe it would have been just as effective for me to just sprint past it. But I would say in some rare situations, jumping can help, but generally it doesn't. As for the proximity mine, no. Jumping is probably the worst thing you could do. You definitely don't want to jump if you set off a proximity mine. So finally, this just brings us to what happens if we crouch or go prone with these. And with the Claymore, definitely you don't want to do this. That's just going to slow you down. You're still going to take the full brunt of the damage here, so don't try and crouch or go prone with a Claymore. That's just silly. However, with the proximity mine, this is exactly what you want to be doing. If you crouch on flat ground against a proximity mine, even if you're right on top of it where it would normally deal 200 damage, you will only take 55 damage in this situation. So you avoid the vast majority of damage just by simply crouching. And with an 880 millisecond time to react to that, this is actually a very easy way to avoid death from a proximity mine. On top of that, if you manage to react really quickly and you have the time to go all the way into being prone, again, assuming flat ground, you will actually take literally 0 damage from a prone position, even if you're right under where that proximity mine is. Now keep in mind, I did mention on flat ground. Sometimes if you're on an angle or a ramp or some weird geometry comes into play that's on an angle, for instance, that can throw a wrench in all of this. But generally speaking, all you need to do to avoid death from a proximity mine is crouch or, if possible, go prone. And this is why, even though the proximity mine deals damage over a significantly larger area, the Claymore is going to give you far more consistent kills with each use. But next up, this finally brings us into the EOD perk and how it interacts with both of these. With the Claymore, if you're standing right up close to it with EOD receiving the maximum amount of damage, you will only take 80 damage from that Claymore, which I do say only, that is quite a bit of damage, but when you consider it goes from 140 damage down to 80, that's pretty nice. A single Claymore will never kill you if you're at full health in core game modes while using EOD. As for the proximity mine, I was very surprised to see, at least in my testing in a custom game, it's exactly the same result. It looks like EOD clamps your damage at 80, and you literally just can't take any more than 80 damage. Now, having said this, in the past, I swear, in public matches, I have died from full health while using EOD to a proximity mine. Not just once, but many times. However, I can't think of that happening anytime recently, so I think one of two things happened here. Either they buffed EOD in relation to the proximity mine lately, so now you're only taking 80 damage, or something strange is going on in custom games that isn't translating to public matches. So at this point, I can't say with absolute confidence that you will always survive a proximity mine if you have full health and EOD, because I know for a fact that wasn't happening in the past, but based on my testing, I can't replicate that at all. And therefore, I would just say, even if you're using EOD, try to make sure you at least crouch when that proximity mine goes off, just to be absolutely positive that it's not going to kill you. But with that, that pretty much covers it for the Claymore versus the proximity mine. And just like most things in this series, you can definitely see some pros and cons for each of them. But if we're taking an honest look at the effectiveness of both of these pieces of equipment, I'm gonna go with the Claymore here. The Claymore just results in far more consistent kills. The proximity mine is way too easy to survive even if you're not using EOD. But at the same time, I do recognize the use of a proximity mine. It can be great if multiple enemies are pushing into the same room at the same time, because it just deals so much damage within a room. Now, in saying that, I just thought of another con with using the proximity mine, and this is, if you're trying to use it to watch your back and you're in a somewhat smaller room, there's a good chance that proximity mine is just going to kill you because it deals damage in a 360-degree radius, so you really have to watch out as the user of that for the damage that it's going to be spitting out. The Claymore, on the other hand, is far more precise and controllable with its damage. So yeah, the more I think about it, the Claymore just keeps pulling further and further in the lead compared to the proximity mine, which is kind of surprising after seeing the damage ranges at the beginning of the video, because if you just looked at those, the proximity mine would be the clear choice, but it just turns out that's not the case, at least for me. Of course though, that's just what I think about this. I'd like to know your guys' thoughts in the comment section down below. Do you think the Claymore is a better piece of defensive equipment, or the proximity mine? If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.